Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lorenzo. Andiamo avanti. Welcome back, Renaissance people, to the Italian Renaissance podcast and the fifth episode dedicated to the court of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. So far, we have looked at Lorenzo as a poet and as a statesman. We've seen the critical role of his mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, and looked at the widespread revival of mythological subjects in both large-scale painting, such as those by Botticelli and Luca Signorelli, and the highly mythologized poetry of Angelo Poliziano. Today, we are sticking with the art history and taking a look at another workshop that was heavily indebted to Lorenzo's influence, that of Antonio and Piero del Pallaiuolo. Very difficult to pronounce that one for me. So Antonio and Piero del Pallaiuolo were born in Florence during the 15th century, so right in the heart of the early Renaissance. Their family wasn't wealthy or noble. In fact, their surname, that difficult name, Pallaiuolo, comes from their father's profession. He was a poulterer, a seller of poultry, chickens. So from the start, the brothers come from a working class background. Antonio, the older brother, he was born at about 1431. He begins his career as a goldsmith, and it's very possible that he may have actually trained in the vast workshop of Lorenzo Ghiberti. That training gave him a sharp eye for details and strong foundation in craftsmanship, skills that would define his work. So Antonio had a curious mind and a strong interest in the sciences, especially anatomy, which would become one of the key influences in his artistic development, anatomy, as we'll see when we get into his works for the Medici. Indeed, Antonio is often accredited with a stronger sense of design when compared to his brother, and that would be Piero. Another Piero, I know, but now we're talking about Piero del Pallaiuolo. Okay. Piero, born about a decade after, about 1443, likely trained under Antonio or in a related workshop environment. Compared to Antonio, Piero's background is a little less documented, and what's clear is that the two brothers remained closely connected throughout their careers. They eventually ran a shared workshop in Florence, which became quite successful and respected, and they eventually go off to Rome and work on papal tombs, which is a major part of their career. Their upbringing in Florence gave them access to one of the most vibrant cultural and artistic scenes that was developed by Cosimo de' Medici and expanded under Lorenzo. Thanks to the city's guild system, which we don't talk a whole lot about, but even artists from modest origins could rise through talent and patronage. And although the brothers didn't come from privilege, they did manage to move in elite circles and gain the attention of influential patrons. Hint, hint, the Medici. What makes this story so compelling is that they embody this Renaissance ideal of the self-made artist, of the individual, right? From a poultry seller's household, they rose to become respected figures in Florence's artistic world. They're balancing traditional training with deep interest in the human form, classical learning brought on by classical revival, and the spirit of innovation that's defining this moment in history. This example is not unique, as we've continued to see the shift from craftsperson, the considered place of pre-Renaissance artist, into individual so-called creative geniuses. Okay? Ultimately, we're looking at a pair of brothers who are often treated together. That's right, the Pallaiuolo workshop. Antonio, in particular, is both an exceptional painter and a sculptor. Likewise, Giorgio Vasari, if we remember the biographer of the artist who was writing in the 16th century, he tells us that Piero studied with Andrea del Castagno, but likewise with Antonio's claim to being a student of Ghiberti, we can't really say for certain. So did Piero study with Andrea del Castagno? Did Antonio study with Ghiberti? It's not known, but what is clear is that Andrea del Castagno's style is echoed in their painted works, as well as that of Piero della Francesca, just as we can find traces of Ghiberti's classicizing style in Antonio's sculptural output. So there's a lot of influences that are going to produce the aesthetic of their work. And we're going to look at both of these today, painting and sculpture, and try to unpack the relationship between their artistic production and Lorenzo's court. That may be difficult to do with scant primary sources, and given that the fair amount of the recorded art no longer exists. For sure, the Pallaiuolo were frequently employed by Lorenzo for ephemeral works. Ephemeral works, that's artwork that is by design not meant to last, like standards, banners, costumes, temporary displays for festivals. If we look back to our biography that we keep coming back to by Judith Hook, that of Lorenzo the Magnificent, she relates Lorenzo's use of commissioning ephemeral festival arts to his role as a statesman, where the Pollaiuolo brothers appear among this cohort of artists dedicated to his festive style. I'm going to read from this biography, quote, "Here, then, we come face to face with the central problem posed by Lorenzo's role as art patron, for in this role he may be regarded in two contradictory lights. He may be seen either as sincerely preoccupied with the arts and with learning, or as using them as part of the process of political management by means of which he dominated Florence. Thus, we know that when it was a question of organizing tournaments, carnival tableaux, or other public festivities, Lorenzo regularly employed distinguished artists of the stature of Antonio Pallaiuolo, Verrocchio, and Botticelli to paint standards, chase armor, design triumphal arches, and to create other decorative ephemera. Such employment may be regarded either as an inspired contribution by Lorenzo to a now lost but once genuine and original art form, the Renaissance public festival, or, as many contemporary critics suggested, it may more properly be viewed as just another means of manipulating the Florentines, diverting them with circuses in order to encourage acquiescence in the Medici regime." Unquote. Public festival, the ephemeral arts, in which these major workshops were employed by the Medici to create a possibly propagandistic, possibly distraction-based festival atmosphere. This reminds us of the reality that a seemingly unlimited number of works by these great artists, Pallaiuolo, Verrocchio, Botticelli, no longer exist, nor were they meant to. Temporary displays, parade floats, and that there is a plethora of visual references that the Renaissance patron would have had in mind from attending such festivals that we cannot wholly access, which means we'll never really have the full range of visual references, even to understand the art that we do still have. This is true of the central work that we are focusing on today, Antonio and Piero del Pallaiuolo's Labors of Hercules. The originals of these were a series of 3 large-scale canvas paintings that may have been designed for one of a similar type of festival by Lorenzo's father, Piero, in 1460. Remember, Piero, too, was a humanist who learned from his father Cosimo and the Neoplatonists of his court. Vasari says that these 3 labors were painted for Lorenzo the Elder. That's Cosimo's brother, but he died in 1440. And unless there's a missing Lorenzo that I can't put my brain on, I can't make sense of Vasari's claim. It seems to go along with this general confusion that he has about the Pallaiuolo, but it could be my general confusion. In all likelihood, these 3 large labors of Hercules were commissioned by Piero, Lorenzo's father. So we have an earlier example of mythological painting, the type that would prefigure the large-scale mythological paintings that Botticelli would make wide-scale and popular in the 1480s. We know the original Labors of Hercules paintings were in the Medici Palace inventory of 1492 upon Lorenzo's death, that very critical document that helps us locate where so many of these Medicean artworks were in the palace or
what have you. It was Lorenzo's inventory when he died. So that is where a lot of this information comes from. I'll come back to the palace and its inventory. Bookmark that. What does indeed remain for us are two smaller versions, two of the three, painted on wood panel by Antonio that likely represent the original works, giving us a glimpse of what truly are among the most remarkable and dynamic pictorial compositions of the Florentine Renaissance. The Pallaiuolo painted 3 of the 12 mythical labors of Hercules. We have 2 miniature versions that remain to us today. I'm talking about 2 small works that likely represent 2 of the 3 compositions that were in the Medici Palace, that being Hercules and the Hydra and Hercules and Antaeus. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Antaeus, from about 1475. And those 2 are now in the Uffizi Gallery. But Lawrence, I thought we were talking about Lorenzo's patronage, not his Papa Piero. Patience, Renaissance people. This is a long history. We don't know what the nature of these small reproductions are, but they are no longer considered to be preparatory for the large ones in the Medici Palace, because they used to be dated to the 1460s when the large ones were made. Now they have been dated to the 1470s in the middle of Lorenzo's reign. We therefore get a glimpse at, and maybe improvements to, the original paintings that no longer exist. We're at the forefront of stark, compelling, dynamic compositions that won't mature until we're in the Baroque period. That's what I'm talking about. Guys, this is huge. So Hercules and Hydra, which is this wild work of art, we have Hercules striding forward in the nude, with the exception of his famous lion skin. What is he doing? He is grabbing the Hydra by one of its many throats and clubbing it to death. The wind takes the lion skin and swoops it back in this sweeping motion. The Hydra's tail coils around Hercules' leg, as well as this gross, weird Hydra paw, kind of hooking the back of his knee as he's about to bash its head in, and it hisses at him ferociously. Now, you have this slithering, serpentine grossness of the Hydra that is mimicked by what is in the background, the landscape, the Arno River Valley, which is slithering through the landscape into the distance. Really, really impressive use of space and depth and composition. But most importantly, we are at the highest moment of action, and that is not actually indicative of Renaissance painting. Renaissance sort of breaks out of stagnancy that we get in some medieval art and pushes protagonists of works into action. Okay, for example, Donatello's David, who's about to just slump down slightly after cutting off the head of Goliath, or Botticelli's Venus in the Primavera, who's drawing up this crowd. There's motion indicated, but it's not force. This is force. He's about to bludgeon the Hydra with this club, and he's got this scrunched up face like it's toiling for him, because this is not a muscular, hulking Hercules. He's sort of sinewy, and this is Pallaiuolo style, these long sort of figures that aren't overly bulky, that aren't overly mighty, that have some little glimpse of, well, the underdog, right? He's not about to overwhelmingly conquer the Hydra. He's going to struggle to conquer the Hydra. It's Florence, guys, the underdog city that keeps triumphing over the enemies that surround it. We'll get back to that. Okay. So this precise moment, this is defiant of traditional art history teaching, right? That the Renaissance, you start to get a little bit of motion. Titian develops it, and another 30, 40 years, Titian's going to show Bacchus jumping out of the carriage at Ariadne. This moment of action suspended in time is going to blow up in the Venetian context. That's one traditional way it's taught. And then by the Baroque period, you always get the highest point of drama. No, 1470s Florence, the Pallaiuolo are already doing it, and were probably already doing it in the 1460s when they did the original works.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
But you have the second work, which is more of our focus today. And this is Hercules and Antaeus. What is going on here? Hercules, on his return from the Garden of the Hesperides, is confronted by the giant Antaeus, the son of the earth deity Gaia. So Hercules has to be witty to conquer his foe. He cleverly lifts the opponent from the earth. Why? Because Antaeus is invincible as long as he was touching the earth, his mother, Gaia. So Hercules has to remove him from the earth. With his foot lifted, Hercules squeezes him to death. A show of a combination of brute force and clever wit that was needed to triumph. We're back to these Florentine sentiments. You cannot win by brute strength alone. You have to have the philosophy and the wit. So what do we have? An Atergo style nude. Atergo means the butt is facing us, with this sort of very sharp bend in his spine to his butt crack, with his lion skin wrapped around it, covering most of it. We said earlier the Pallaiuolo are obsessed with anatomy, and Antaeus is also nude, and he is being crushed by, again, a Hercules who is kind of wiry, kind of not jacked, well, excuse me, for lack of a better term, and he's grimacing and his teeth are clenching together. And this poor, much more muscular man, Antaeus, this demigod, this half deity, is getting the life completely crushed out of him. It's the moment in which Hercules' grip is the strongest, and Antaeus is on his last breath of resisting. He is trying to scream, but his mouth is wide open, and you imagine that nothing can come out because the air has been squeezed out of his body, and he is in his last effort to force Hercules off of him before Hercules ultimately crushes him to death. Both of these panels, the Hydra, Antaeus, were actually stolen by the Germans in World War II, and then they were rediscovered in the United States in the 1960s, 1963, and eventually returned to Florence, where they are now in the Uffizi Gallery. So yes, we have these two they're small, they're very small, these very tiny works that are representative of the pre-existing larger works that were in the Medici Palace. But it is what comes of these works next that I believe to be the most exciting and striking. Remember, I told you that Antonio was trained as a sculptor as well. Not only does Vasari tell us that Antonio worked on Medici portrait medallions that represented the Pazzi conspiracy, although I have seen similar medallions that are not by the hand of Pallaiuolo, and I actually cannot find the medallions that Vasari is talking about. I don't know if it was a misattribution, and it's sort of driving me crazy if I cannot find them, or at least find a document that says, no, these are not Pallaiuolo, they are, who was it, Bertoldo di Giovanni, whoever did the current medals. In any case, Antonio certainly completed a small bronze sculpture after the painting of Hercules and Antaeus. Okay, this is so cool. Most sources agree that the bronze sculpture in question was directly commissioned by Lorenzo the Magnificent as part of his efforts of cultural reform. I want to stress the translation of this composition, the painting, sometime around 1475, created a work with a type of dynamic pose in sculpture that had not yet been seen in the Renaissance. The sculpture still has that sinewy Pallaiuolo anatomy, but there is more strength and force to it. There also has to be new invention in rendering the 2D pose that you see in the painting to the three-dimensional in the round poses of the sculpture. The lion skin no longer covers this sort of Atergo style nude, but it falls to the ground, serving as a means to actually secure the top heavy composition. So he had to be very inventive to translate this into bronze. And it's not a huge sculpture. So we have this, the Medici, Hercules, the Pallaiuolo. There's a much larger political history here. In Renaissance Florence, Hercules wasn't just the mythological hero. He was a powerful political and cultural symbol. For the Florentines, especially the ruling Medici family, Hercules represented strength, virtue, and intelligence triumphing over chaos and brute force. Hercules embodied the kind of ideal citizen leader the city admired. Courageous, morally upright, and clever. Hint, hint, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Florence saw itself as let's say, a new Athens, the Athens on the Arno, a republic rooted in classical ideals and civic responsibility. In that context, Hercules became a symbol of the city's identity, especially during times of political tension and external threat. So these legendary 12 labors, overcoming monsters and completing impossible tasks, were seen as metaphors for the challenges that the Florentine Republic faced in maintaining independence and order. So through the Pallaiuolo, we see the Medici, specifically Lorenzo, who were deeply invested in classical learning and imagery, using Hercules deliberately in their art commissions and palace decorations. These are for the palace. He stood for their authority, but in a humanist, heroic framework, not as a tyrant, but as a wise protector of the people. Artists like Antonio del Pallaiuolo brought Hercules to life in these paintings and in this sculpture. He's emphasizing the human body, movement, struggle, and strife, but he's turning myth into something immediate and relatable to contemporary viewers. So through Hercules, Renaissance Florence celebrated not just power, but the triumph of reason and virtue of humanistic culture, which of course Lorenzo was paying for. So Florentine admiration of Hercules is not locked in the Renaissance moment, but dates back centuries before. It's only being used for a Medici regime placed upon the Republic. If we continue to consider the idea of Florentine libertas, liberty, as a central cultural motif, then in the same way, David served as a Medici symbol, as in Donatello's David, Verrocchio's David. Hercules did so in the exact same way, but closer to the trends of classical, humanistic, mythological revival that was flourishing during Lorenzo's time in power. When Lorenzo died, and after his son Piero was expelled, many of their palace artworks were reappropriated to conform to the ideals of the new republic, the post-Medicean republic. So, just as Donatello's Judith and his David were relocated to the Palazzo della Signoria, the Palazzo Vecchio, so were the Pollaiuolo brothers' massive original Labors of Hercules. The same symbols, David, Judith, Hercules, that the Medici used to represent themselves as the underdog heroes, diligently fighting against the larger oppressive forces outside of Florence to maintain Florentine libertas, are the symbols the Republic appropriated as anti-tyrant, anti-Medici symbols. Cue Michelangelo's David in the following years. Ultimately, the Pallaiuolo brothers both died the same year, 1498. We see a lot of Medici people dying in the 1490s, even though I don't think theirs was related to what we saw with Poliziano, who might have been poisoned. Renaissance people. Unlike the poor, crushed, and suffocated Antaeus, we still have a lot of wind left in our lungs. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, arrivederci.